Hi Year 9, welcome back to these learning videos on Jekyll and Hyde. Today we're looking at satire. Now this lesson is quite difficult to understand. I think a lot of people find it difficult to comprehend the difference between satire and parody. So please stick at it because it is difficult. And if you've got any questions, you please just let me know because you won't be the only one with questions with this lesson. Anyway, so let's get started. So in this lesson, you'll learn about the potential avenues for satire in Stevenson's text and consider the text as a criticism of the Gothic and polite society. So let's look at the difference between satire and parody first. So is it possible that something as disturbing and enthralling as Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde could be satire? First, it is important that we differentiate between parody and satire. A parody is a work of art that adapts from or reflects another piece of art with the intent of poking fun at the original. You might think of the fake commercials or even some of the sketches on television programmes such as Saturday Night Live. They transform the meaning of original things to elicit laughter. Satire, on the other hand, is more biting. It can still be funny, but it has bigger goals. Typically, satire makes a social critique. Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal advocates eating babies to help the Irish people. Obviously, Swift doesn't actually want people to eat babies. Instead, he's drawing attention to the plight of the poor through satire. So he's taking the mick, basically. He's drawing our attention to these issues in society through satire. So in a way, it's kind of twisted. This is a table to maybe help you. And this is your task. So I want you to find an example of your own for parody and satire in the world today. Are there any TV shows that you know which might be a parody? Are there any books you know which might be a satire? Something like that. Or even a song. Songs can also be a satire almost. So let's look at satire of the Gothic. So this is where you might get slightly confused. So keep with me. And again, if you get stuck, then message me. So the Gothic is a literary genre that began in the 18th century. So we're just going to have a recap of the Gothic first. It became wildly popular with Anne Radcliffe, who set her novels in foreign castles and introduced supernatural elements that she would later explain. The Gothic was also considered cheap literature by most critics. Jane Austen parodied the Gothic in her 1817 novel Northanger Abbey, though the parody is more loving than biting. By the mid-19th century, the Gothic mode had fallen out of favour. Realism, which meant that authors held a mirror to the world, was now the favourite mode. So instead of critiquing the world as we know it, back in the 18th century or 19th century, realism became favourable, of literally writing as the world actually is, instead of critiquing it through satire. There were still Gothic scenes and texts, of course, but the genre had ostensibly died out. So it pretty much died out at this point, at the point that Stevenson was writing. So then Stevenson's text came along, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and it burst onto the scene. In some sense, Stevenson revived the Gothic and paved the way for other familiar Gothic novels, such as Bram Stoker's Dracula. But there's a chance that Stevenson's novel is a satire of the Gothic. Stevenson claimed that he came up with the idea for the novel in a dream. Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, made the same claim. So there's some similarity there between the two authors. So could this be the first element of Stevenson's satire? Could he be critiquing such a wild story origin? Stevenson might have revitalised the Gothic only to drag it down again. He created something pulpy, short, and readable, intended for masses of people, so he wanted his book to be really accessible. He knew that this sort of literature would not be respected, though, so he made the professional people in the novel the villains. In other words, rather than borrowing from the Gothic's use of foreign villains, Stevenson satirises the Gothic mode by highlighting the villainy of the novel's protagonists. Jekyll, the professional doctor, is just as much a villain as Hyde, and Utterson, the ambulance chaser, who wants to see his name returned to Jekyll's will, is far from heroic. So what we're seeing here is members from polite society actually being seen as villains in the text, which goes against the norms for Victorian society, because of course the aristocracy and the polite society were seen as the heroes in society anyway. And for Stevenson to then turn this on its head and see these figures as villains was not the norm, and was seen to kind of drag the genre down. So, task. Can you research some more about realism for me? You could even create a timeline for the various literary periods. So this one here, you can't really read it too well, but you could do something along these lines. So we've got Old English here, then Middle English, Renaissance, Neoclassical, Romantic, Victorian. You could do something similar to this, but make it more detailed. What books, what authors were famous of these times? Okay, so let's look at Satire of Degeneration and Polite Society. This slide is going to take us back in time to our video on Allegory in the text. So it might be a good idea to actually re-watch that video on Allegory to help you understand this slide. So Charles Darwin's 1871 text, The Descent of Man, argues that the human species is descended from primates. Victorian society was very worried about such a possibility and feared that the species could be degenerating back into animals, just like Hyde did. In the novel, Jekyll concocts a serum that will transform him into Hyde so that he can satiate his carnal desires. Remember, carnal means sexual. However, the point of the text is that Jekyll does not degenerate into Hyde, but rather that Hyde is already a part of Jekyll. Most of the characters in the novel are professionals and part of polite society, but Stevenson suggests that these educated aristocratic men hide a Hyde. And Stevenson is rather explicit with his wordplay here. So remember when we did that stuff, that lesson on puns, and how interesting it is that he uses that wordplay with hide, literally hiding, and hide as in the name Hyde. So in other words, Stevenson satirises the thought that criminals and prostitutes are the degenerates, demonstrating instead that every human has a degenerate raging inside of them. So instead of Jekyll and Hyde being two separate entities or identities, they are seen as the same person, kind of split. So you've got one person split into two personalities type of thing. So we've all got a Hyde inside of us, is what Stevenson is arguing. So next task. How does this knowledge link to our lesson before on Allegory in the text? If you go back to the video on Allegory and you see this picture, that will be the slide that you need to look at in order to answer this question. All right then, so this is our mini quiz for today. Again, it's multiple choice. Have you understood today's knowledge? And yeah, I'm going to put the answers on Teams after you complete this lesson anyway. And finally, let's review. So, whereas parody is based on humour, satire is a biting social critique. Stevenson's text could be satirising several things, including the Gothic and fears over degeneration. The Gothic had fallen out of favour, so Stevenson may have made his own adaptation that instead satirises his readership. And finally, Victorian society was worried about degeneration and blamed criminals, prostitutes, and the mentally ill. But Stevenson shows that the degenerates are already part of polite society. So, in a way, this shows that Stevenson was quite controversial for his time. And I guess that's what makes his book unique and very, very popular, because he is going across boundaries. And final task, write down one interesting piece of context that we could link to this lesson or that you have learned in today's lesson. Okay, thank you for listening. And again, if you've got any questions on this, please ask me, because I know it's really difficult. So good luck.